Hey guy, tonight you're locked in a Roman prison. It's dark, it's damp. And your dinner? That depends on whether your family bribed the guard or forgot you exist. You'll be sharing the night with stale barley crusts, sour water, and the sound of someone nearby chewing something that is, you pray, not a rat. Like the video. Subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy the historical videos I'm making to help you sleep. Comment below with where you're tuning in from and what time it is, because seeing where everyone's listening helps grow this quiet space for late-night history lovers like you. Now get comfortable. Dim the lights. Wrap yourself in something warm. Let the fan hum, and prepare to fall asleep while learning how Rome handled hunger, confinement, and complete indifference to your suffering. Because tonight, dinner's not coming. You may close your eyes now and imagine silence. Not peace, but the other kind. The kind that settles in the stones beneath an ancient city where sunlight never reaches and the air smells like mildew, metal, and slow decay. In the heart of ancient Rome, beneath the noise of the streets and the polished marble of the Senate, prisoners waited. Not for trial, not always for release. Sometimes they waited for nothing at all, for weeks, for months. Some waited for years. And while they waited, they were hungry. The Romans were not sentimental about confinement. They did not build prisons to correct behavior. They built them to contain it. Rome's carceral system was simple. Arrest, detain, then decide. If a verdict came swiftly, so did punishment. But if bureaucracy crept slowly, as it often did, the body was left to fend for itself. And that included food. There was no organized prison kitchen. No guaranteed meal, no promise of water. The state provided little, and sometimes nothing. For a prisoner to eat, someone outside had to care. A brother, a servant, a wife. Someone with enough influence or money or persistence to push past a gatekeeper and place a bowl into waiting hands. If no one came, hunger came instead. Bread was the most common offering, but not the fresh, soft loaves of the upper classes. Prisoners received hard crusts, dry, dense, often old, not made to please, but to endure. These were fragments of military rations or cheap peasant bread, made from barley, not wheat, and baked in coarse ovens until nearly inedible. The outer layer was often blackened. Inside it was dense and sour, sometimes gritty with bits of stone left from poor milling. If there was water, it was drawn from public cisterns or leftover basins, often warm, sometimes stale. Its taste carried whatever vessel had last held it. A leather skin, a metal cup. Sometimes the hint of rust or animal fat lingered on the surface. On rare occasions, lentils or beans were boiled until soft and delivered in crude bowls. These were humble, protein-rich foods, common in the Roman poor diet, and cheap to prepare. But in prison, even this was a luxury. Beans left too long soured quickly. More often, they arrived lukewarm, lumpy, and flavorless. When guards were in a generous mood, or easily bribed, dried fruits might appear, figs especially. Their sweetness was prized. Not because they were rare, but because they reminded the prisoner of life outside. A single fig, sticky and sun-dried, could feel like a treasure. It could be traded. It could be hidden. Or it could be eaten all at once, slowly with eyes closed, as if remembering a vineyard long forgotten. For prisoners of rank, especially those from the equestrian or senatorial class, meals could be slightly better. They were sometimes allowed to dine according to their status, if only to preserve appearances before execution. A condemned noble might be served wine, a piece of cooked meat, a dish of olives. But even then, it was never about compassion. It was spectacle. Mercy served cold, with an audience. The poorest prisoners, the nameless ones, ate what they could scavenge. Mold on a wall, insects from a corner. Some chewed cloth, others nibbled on wax, hoping to trick the stomach. There are whispers in ancient texts, not common but persistent, of prisoners who consumed the leather of their own sandals, softened in water, torn into strips, swallowed slowly without salt. Food became currency. A crust of bread could buy time. A dried plum might soften a guard's voice. A bowl of porridge could be traded for silence. In this subterranean economy, hunger dictated every choice. Meals were not for nourishment. They were negotiation, and failure to eat was not a punishment, but a symptom of being forgotten. Some prisoners found their last meal laced with something darker. Cicero records that condemned men were sometimes offered wine laced with poison. It was not framed as an execution. It was a courtesy, a choice even. Drink this, and die quietly. Refuse, and face the blade. Either way, there would be no second serving. The Romans, for all their obsession with order and ritual, gave little thought to those they caged. The prison was not a place for reform. It was a space between. A liminal holding chamber where time slowed, appetite dulled, and the body learned to forget its needs. Eating became an act of memory, of survival, of waiting. What a prisoner ate in ancient Rome depended not on guilt or innocence, but on money, on connections, on luck, and most of all, on how long the city remembered they were alive. So tonight, as you lie still, consider those other still bodies beneath the stones. Not heroes, not martyrs, just people, chewing in the dark, swallowing silence, and dreaming of bread. You don't feel the walls, but they are there, close, damp, cold from within, not from weather. This is not a cell, not in the modern sense. It is a stone void. It exists for waiting, and when the body fail, when hunger finally does its slow work, the city does not weep. It simply moves on. The Roman world left little space for prisoners to die with dignity. There were no death records for the nameless, no rituals for the poor, just absence. A human shape that had once needed food, now silent. Starvation was not written into the law, but it happened predictably. Sometimes by design, sometimes because someone simply stopped bringing the bread. In the Tullianum, that ancient underground prison near the Forum, prisoners who died were often left untouched for hours. The jailers waited. There was no urgency. Once the breath left the body, so too did any legal responsibility. It was now a matter of disposal. Some were buried quietly in mass graves outside the city, in pits with others. No markers, no names, just limbs pressed to limbs, mouths still dry, fingers curled from cold. Others, especially the condemned, were left on display. The body became a warning, a message to the crowd, and occasionally, when executions were rushed or irregular, corpses stayed locked in the lower chamber for days. The smell moved faster than the bureaucracy. Cicero once described a prison execution that took place not in a public square, but in the dark. The condemned man was strangled, not by rope, but by the pressure of the space itself. He had been starved for days, then suffocated in a cell too narrow to kneel. His body was disposed of before dawn. Roman prisons were not designed for death. They were designed for delay. So when death arrived, it felt like an interruption, a bureaucratic inconvenience. The jailer had to write it down if anyone asked. Otherwise, they carried the corpse out by nightfall, sometimes rolled in a worn cloth, other times carried by fellow prisoners. But not all bodies were removed with silence. Political prisoners, especially those caught in conspiracy, were often subjected to posthumous treatment. Heads removed, hands cut off, bodies burned without ceremony. These were not meals, these were messages. Food itself in these final hours took on strange significance. For some, the last meal became a ritual, not because it was tradition, but because it was offered only once. A single plate, bread and figs, wine. Sometimes poisoned, sometimes not. You never knew which. Prisoners often ate this last offering with gratitude, not because they believed in mercy, but because, in Rome, being fed meant someone still remembered you. Even slaves who died in confinement were not always reclaimed. Their remains were sometimes sold for minor fees to industries needing bones. It sounds absurd now, but in a city that counted slaves by the hundreds of thousands, the individual body meant little. The appetite that had once driven it. Forgotten, those who survived long enough to be freed often left prison sick, pale, hunched, stomachs unable to handle normal food. Some had developed ulcers, others had lost teeth from chewing dried crusts day after day, month after month. They limped through the markets like ghosts. Alive, yes, but hollow. And even then, they remembered the taste of fig skin, the sour water, the way beans softened only slightly in the bowl when there wasn't enough fire to cook them through. Prison hunger rewired the mind. It taught the body to crave not fullness, but texture. Anything chewable, anything that passed the throat. There are accounts of prisoners chewing straw, not to eat it, but to remind themselves of life, of jaw movement, of purpose. The great Roman satirist Juvenal once mocked the idea of prison comfort. He laughed at the thought of criminals being fed like citizens. For him, starvation was part of the penalty, but for those inside, hunger was not punishment. It was existence. When they were released, the few who made it, they did not speak of pain. They spoke of meals, of crumbs, of how long it took a barley cake to mold, of the one time a guard smuggled in goat cheese, sharp, rancid, perfect. It is in these small details that Roman prison history survives, not in epic records, not in inscriptions, but in the dry, brittle observations of those who passed through the dark and came out remembering the food. That was the legacy. Not justice, not rehabilitation, but the memory of swallowing something, anything, and wondering if it would be the last time. So tonight, as your mind fades into the hush of sleep, remember the ones who feed it too, but not all at once, who chewed slowly in silence and tasted history from the bottom of the empire. In the quiet places of Roman justice, women were almost always unseen. But they were there, at the gates, behind the guards, and sometimes inside the cells. They were not guards, they were not prosecutors, but when it came to food, to the quiet act of sustaining life, Roman women were often the only ones who remembered. The legal system did not make room for them. Roman law was blunt. Women could be imprisoned, but they rarely had the same rights as men once inside. They were more likely to disappear, to be held without trial, especially if they were enslaved, foreign, or poor. No one recorded the exact number of women imprisoned in the empire. It wasn't seen as worth counting. But we know they were there, because sometimes they are mentioned in passing, in grief, in sarcasm. A grieving mother once stood outside the Tullianum, begging a jailer to pass bread to her daughter. The guard refused, so the mother paid another prisoner, a man, to pass it along. The act was simple, a piece of food, a gesture of memory. but it left a trace in Roman legal commentary, where jurists debated whether it counted as assisting a convict. Roman women were often the last link between the forgotten and the living. They brought bread wrapped in cloth, water in old jugs, sometimes even dried herbs, mint, pennyroyal, crushed fennel, to mask the smell of rot inside the prisons. These were not grand acts. There were no parades, just footsteps, early in the morning, down narrow alleyways to silent doors. They waited there. Sometimes they were turned away. Sometimes they waited for hours. But still they came back the next day. Even female prisoners, those held inside for crimes real or imagined, found ways to feed each other. A scrap hidden under a blanket. A half-chewed crust passed silently in the dark. Small exchanges, made not out of charity but understanding. Some women were imprisoned while pregnant, others gave birth in confinement. In both cases, the Roman state had no system. If a baby cried, the mother had to hush it with her own dry hand. If she had food, she shared it. If not, she watched. Seneca the Younger, in one of his letters, recalls a woman imprisoned unjustly. He never names her. He never tells us her crime, only that she refused food for 3 days, not in protest, but because she could not eat what was offered. It smelled too strongly of damp wood and old hands. By the 4th day, she accepted a single fig and wept. The Roman aristocracy had little interest in these stories. Their prison tales were full of drama, plots, betrayals, noble suicides. They wrote about men who schemed, men who dined before death. But the women were still there, waiting outside gates, bringing food, carrying memory. Sometimes women cooked for prisoners who could pay, not directly, but through hired hands. A wealthy man under house arrest might pay a servant to bring him prepared dishes. These meals were often made by women. Olive mash, fish sauces, flatbread brushed with oil. They never saw the prisoner, but their hands fed him all the same. Even executions sometimes had women in the background. A wife preparing the final meal, a sister arriving with wine. Not allowed inside, just close enough to pass the cup through the bars if the guard allowed it. These acts were not remembered in marble. No statues of Roman women holding loaves, no triumphal arches to celebrate their care. But the crumbs they passed were real. They kept people alive. And when death came, it was often a woman who collected the body, paid the fee, arranged the burial. If they could not afford it, they buried in secret, in the early hours, in unmarked soil. Even then, food remained. A grave might contain a small offering, a figiel mesteto, a crust of bread, not for the body, but for the memory. These were not sentimental gestures. They were cultural reflexes, acts of endurance, of honoring the fact that someone had once eaten and should not be forgotten. The Roman state recorded few names of imprisoned women. It kept fewer records of who fed them, but the mouths were fed, the water was passed, the taste of herbs lingered even in the dark. And tonight, as you lie still, know this. History often forgets the hands that fed the dying, but the prisoners never did. Not as long as their stomachs remembered the warmth, not as long as the breath still lingered, soft and shallow after a final bite. They didn't call it waste, not in Rome. They called it scrap, leftover refuse. It was the back end of every meal, the spoiled barley, the hardened cheese rind, the water that had stood too long in copper pots. And when the rich finished dining, when slaves scraped bones off plates and swept crusts off marble floors, someone always asked, where would it go? The answer was never clean. Sometimes it went to the pigs. Sometimes it went into the gutters, but sometimes, quietly, it went to the prisons. Roman prisons didn't have kitchens, but they had doors, and those doors opened to people with bags filled with what no one else wanted to eat. The city of Rome, crowded and vast, produced more edible waste than it could bury. But even waste had value. Bread that had turned hard could still be chewed. Olive mash that had fermented could still be spread. Sour wine could still numb the tongue, and all of this could be fed to the forgotten behind the iron bars. Prisoners ate with their fingers. There were no utensils, no bowls, unless brought in. Meals, if they came, arrived on rags, or in waxed paper, or barehanded, dropped through a small opening and left to rot if untouched. It's not that Rome planned this system. It simply grew into it. Markets closed in the afternoon, stalls were swept. And anything unsold, fish too dry, fruit too bruised, grain too damp, was sorted. Some of it went to the poor, some to the slaves, and some to the prison gates. No record exists of an official prison supplier. There was no office, no title, no oversight. But we know it happened, because Roman texts hint at it in satire, in complaints. A senator once joked that the only honest bread in Rome could be found in a prison, because no baker would dare sell it elsewhere. The bread was often blackened, not from burning, from spoilage. It was called panis niger, black bread, made from barley husks, bean flour, and whatever grain sweepings were cheapest that day. The loaves were dense. So dense, in fact, that soldiers once used them to stop spear wounds. In prison, they were gnawed slowly. Some prisoners dipped them in water to soften them. Others bit until their gums bled. Cheese was rarer, but if it came hard. Old sheep's cheese, cracked and dry, with a sharpness like vinegar. Sometimes it was tinged green at the edges. Prisoners cut off the mold if they could. If not, they ate it anyway. Fish scraps arrived in clay pots, not fillet, bones, anchovy heads, scales, what remained after the garum had been drained. It smelled like rot and sea brine, but it was salty. And salt kept the mind alert, at least for a while. Even fruit arrived, overripe, soft, sometimes split open. Figs that had gone dark, dates beginning to ferment, grapes already shriveling into early raisins. There was no choice. You bit or you starved. The water came last, carried in reused jugs, warm, opaque, and sometimes shared by 4 or 5 prisoners in the same corner of the cell. It tasted like the jar, and the jar tasted like the last thing it held: oil, vinegar, or something unknown. Food in prison was measured not in calories, but in time. Could this crust last another hour? Would this fig keep the hunger quiet until sunset? No one spoke of taste, only survival. Spoiled food brought more than rot. It brought disease, dysentery, mouth ulcers, stomach cramps so sharp they left prisoners curled for days, motionless in the dark, chewing air. Some prisoners died not from execution, but from what they ate trying to avoid it. The irony was cruel, but in Rome, cruelty was routine. Jailers, when bribed, could deliver better scraps: a half-cooked egg, a piece of lamb fat, a spoonful of lentils. But it cost more than most prisoners had, so the scraps remained scraps, and the gut remained empty. The city outside dined on bread and olives, on goat and wine, but the city beneath, the hidden city, the prison city, ate what was discarded. They ate what Rome didn't want, and somehow they lived. So when you drift into sleep tonight, let your thoughts settle not on the banquets of emperors, but on the fragments, the broken pieces, the rind, the hardened crust, the last bite no one else wanted, passed through bars to someone who chewed slowly, and called it dinner. It wasn't always called a last meal. The Romans had no formal phrase for it, but they understood what it meant. One final act of swallowing before silence. Execution in ancient Rome could be swift or delayed, a sword, a cross, a strangling collar in a dark chamber. But before death, there was sometimes a pause, a moment to chew, and the food given in that moment, if it came, was more than sustenance. It was ritual. Some believed it was a form of clemency, a small gesture of humanity in an otherwise brutal system. Others saw it as spectacle, proof that even in death, Rome remained civilized. The condemned would not die hungry, they would die as citizens, or at least as bodies still bearing Roman law. Not every prisoner received a final meal. It depended on status, on wealth, on timing. The poor went quickly, the forgotten quicker still. But when the condemned had a name, the meal had meaning. Senators sentenced to death were sometimes offered wine, a small cup, poured deliberately. They drank it slowly, and occasionally they knew it was poisoned. Poison was not always cruel. In elite circles it was a cleaner death, a faster one, and the poison came mixed with sweetness. Fig syrup, mulled wine, ground herbs to calm the stomach before the end. Cicero tells of a man condemned for treason who ate roasted chicken and soft bread before drinking the cup. He didn't finish the meal, but he chewed slowly and thanked the guard. It was not gratitude, it was ritual. Some prisoners were offered only water, but even that could carry weight. A final swallow, a cleansing. The liquid slid down a dry throat, and for a moment the body remembered life. In the provinces, far from the grandeur of Rome, the last meal was more practical. Whatever was available, grain mash, boiled greens, sometimes a lump of goat cheese wrapped in cloth. There was no ceremony, only hunger, and the knowledge that there would be no second portion. For Christians condemned in the early empire, the final meal could be more symbolic. Bread and wine, eaten not as food, but as sacrament, the body of one condemned mirroring the body of another. Sometimes guards joined them, not in solidarity, but in custom. They ate alongside the prisoner as witnesses, so that when the breath stopped, they could say, "He ate, he drank, he died." Women, when condemned, rarely received the same dignity. Their deaths were often rushed, messy, hidden. But there are rare mentions, in court records and funeral inscriptions, of last offerings. A mother feeding her daughter, a sister bringing dates, a wife sneaking in a fig still warm from her own pocket. These were not meals. They were memory, a way of saying, you are still human, still remembered, even now, and the condemned, if they could swallow, did so with care, not with fear, not with regret, but with the slow awareness that the act of chewing, once ordinary, had become sacred. Bread became more than food. It became the final link to the world, to breath, to law, to the rhythm of the city above, where people still ate without thinking. In some executions, the prisoner requested specific food. These requests were not always honored, but when they were treated with respect. One man asked for olives, another for honey. One, famously, for silence, and nothing more. Rome did not promise dignity in death, but it allowed glimpses of it, flickers, through the mouth, through the belly, through the final moment when food entered the body, and the body knew this was the end. And so tonight, as you close your eyes and listen for silence, remember them. Not just the names etched in marble, but the ones who ate alone, quietly, slowly, savoring the bite, knowing it would be the last, Philosophers argued over whether this was bravery or madness. Seneca believed it was liberty. Others disagreed. They said starvation was cowardice, an escape from justice. But the prisoners didn't write. They just stopped eating. In the eyes of Roman law, a dead man was a closed case. There were no appeals after death. So if hunger won, the state didn't argue. It recorded a death, moved on, and yet the bodies remained. Thin, bent, eyes sunk inward, teeth often missing, not from age, but from grinding crusts before the hunger began. Sometimes families claimed the body, sometimes they didn't. Starvers were not always honored. Their choice unsettled people. A man killed by execution was a victim. A man killed by his own hunger was harder to define. Not martyr, not criminal, just quiet. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, remember them. Not for their names. Most are lost. Not for their crimes. Many were innocent. But for their silence. For the way they faced the darkest chamber and chose, without words, not to eat. It's easy to forget smell. But in Roman prisons you couldn't. It was the first thing that met you, before light, before touch, before words. The scent came from the walls, stone, soaked over years with things that don't wash out. Sweat, blood, Moldavian, not strong, not sharp, just always there. A prisoner entering the Tullianum for the first time would notice it immediately. That warm, earthy rot, the kind that clung to clothes, skin, hair, that got under fingernails and stayed there even after washing. The Romans wrote little about the prison smell, not because it wasn't real, but because it was expected, like heat in summer or smoke in the forum. If you were in prison, you were meant to suffer, and suffering had a scent. The bread brought into the cells added another layer. It was usually stale by the time it arrived, hard, dry, with the sour edge of over-fermentation. Barley bread, coarse and bitter, sometimes mixed with bean flour or ground husk. It carried the smell of damp cloth and hands that had touched too many things. Prisoners didn't eat in silence, they ate in scent. When one broke the crust open, the smell of old grain spread through the room, not comforting, not warm, just heavy. If there were beans, they came in thick paste, boiled too long, sour, with the faint scent of ash from cheap cooking fires, the kind that burned low and smoky using wet wood or dried dung. Rot was everywhere. Not fresh rot, old rot, the kind that lives in corners, that soaks into linen, that makes your nose stop noticing after the third day, and then there were the latrines, or the lack of them. Some cells had buckets, others had nothing. Prisoners relieved themselves in the same spaces where they slept, ate, and waited. There were no drains, no fresh water, no soap. In summer, the smell thickened. In winter, it settled. Clothing absorbed it, hair carried it, guards noticed. But they didn't care. Their job was not to clean, only to keep the door closed. Sometimes rats brought their own smells. They nested near food scraps. They chewed wax and cloth. They left trails of urine, of waste, of small, greasy footprints that glowed in torchlight. Even oil lamp, when used, gave off their own sour odor. Animal fat burned slow. It filled the nose with heaviness, a mix of tallow and smoke, better than darkness, but not by much. Bodies that died in prison added a final note. They weren't removed quickly, sometimes not for a day, sometimes not for 3. The scent of death, when it came, was unmistakable. Not like meat, not like sickness. It was sweet and wrong, sticky in the air. It clung to bread. It crept into mouths while chewing. Prisoners tried to cover it. Some smeared their lips with herbs if they had any. Some wrapped cloth around their faces. Most just breathed through it and waited. Hope, too, had a smell. At least, the kind of hope that didn't last. When a prisoner was told they might be released, their body changed. They noticed the stink more. They noticed what they had stopped smelling long ago. And when the release never came, the hope soured. It became another scent, not in the air, but in the breath. In the way a man exhaled when he gave up. There were no perfumes in prison, no oils, no incense, only the natural decay of Rome's forgotten. Even visitors noticed. Those few who came to deliver food or money or news. They stood at the threshold. They wrinkled their noses. And they left quickly. Some never returned, not because of fear, but because they couldn't carry the smell home. Prisoners carried it always, in their hair, in the folds of their tunics, in the backs of their throats. Even years after release, some still claimed they could smell it when they slept. The scent of Roman prison was not just filth, it was memory, layered, sour, permanent. So tonight, as you rest in stillness, take a deep breath, clean, cool, forgotten, and remember that somewhere long ago, someone else also breathed in the dark, and it did not smell like freedom. There was never enough food, not for prisoners, not for the ones below. But there were always rats. They came before sunset, small, gray, fast. They knew the corners. They knew where scraps were dropped. And they waited, not for mercy, not for justice, but for crusts. In Roman prisons, the rats did not fear humans. They shared the same walls, the same stale air, the same hunger. Sometimes they arrived first, before the bread could be eaten, before the beans could be finished, before the body had enough strength to reach down. They chewed fast. They chewed silently. They knew the corners that guards didn't see. Roman texts rarely mention the rats. Vermin were expected. In temples, in homes, in baths. But in prisons, they were part of the sentence. When a man was thrown into the Tullianum, no one warned him about them. No one needed to. He would hear them that night, scratching, biting, tearing into the same barley loaves he'd been given hours before. Some rats gnawed at cloth, others chewed wax, but most followed scent, to bread, to beans, to grease left on stone floors. Guards sometimes used them. They dropped spoiled food near known nests. If the prisoner was too weak to eat, the rats would finish it. It was cheaper than cleaning. They weren't large, not like modern city rats, but they were many, and they were not afraid of the dying. There are quiet records, not official, just whispered, of prisoners waking up with bites, fingers, toes, ears, small teeth marks, blood dried in lines. A senator once joked that the only consistent feeding in prison was done by rodents. They dined nightly. They never missed a meal. It wasn't just about food. It was about hierarchy. The prisoner, starving, begged for bread. The rat, full, carried off crust. One had voice. One had teeth. Even the smell of food attracted them. A cracked fig, a smear of oil, a drop of wine from a forgotten cup. If it wasn't eaten fast, it disappeared in the dark. Prisoners tried to defend their meals. They covered food with rags, slept with it in their arms, bit down hard even while sleeping, afraid it would vanish by morning. Some shared with the rats, not out of kindness, out of exhaustion. They left crumbs in corners to draw them away. Sometimes it worked, sometimes not. There were no cats in prison, no traps, just silence, and the slow knowledge that if you couldn't eat fast, you didn't eat at all. Some prisoners learned to eat what the rats didn't want: olive pits, hardened crusts, bone fragments. The rats took the rest. In one known case, a prisoner too weak to chew, the rats dragged his bread away while he slept. He woke to nothing, and laughed, or cried. No one recorded which. When the guards noticed, they shrugged. If rats were eating the food, that meant it wasn't wasted. Rotten grain? Let the rats take it. Sour meat? Leave it in the dark. The rats were unofficial janitors. They cleaned what Rome refused to see. Even waste, human waste, didn't scare them. They burrowed through it, nested in it, came out cleaner than the men who slept beside it. Some prisoners named them, not as pets, but as companions, as witnesses, as proof that something, anything in that place still wanted to live. And when the prisoner died, the rats came first. They didn't eat flesh, not always, but they searched the body for food, for warmth, for anything left behind in a pouch or fold of cloth. It was not cruelty, it was instinct, and it went unpunished. When the corpse was removed, the rats stayed, waiting, until the next body arrived, and the next bread, and the next night. So tonight, as you sleep in silence, know that somewhere long ago someone else slept too, wrapped around a crust, afraid of tiny teeth, and dreaming of a meal not yet stolen. When the prisoner died, nothing happened at first. There was no bell, no sudden alarm, no priest arriving with oils. Sometimes the cellmates whispered it. Other times they simply looked away. The breath had stopped, the fingers had cooled, and the body had begun its quiet work of leaving. Roman prisons did not have protocols. They had habits, and death was one of them. The jailer would come eventually, not because of urgency, but because the smell made it necessary. He would peer through a slot, wait, check for movement, then turn away. A note might be made on a tablet, a name scratched beside a date, but only if the name mattered. Most didn't. If the prisoner was a citizen, or wealthy, the body might be removed within hours. A cart brought quietly, a servant waiting outside, a funeral arranged before sunset. The family, if allowed, could pay the standard burial fee, buy a cloth, rent a slab of land, commission a brief inscription. Here lies Marcus, or Lucius, or someone with 3 names. But if there was no family, or no money, the body stayed, until the rot became unbearable. Then came the disposal. It wasn't burial, it wasn't ceremony, it was removal. Men assigned to the task, not priests, not officials, just laborers, carried the corpse out, sometimes by arm, sometimes by rope, sometimes rolled in the prisoner's own blanket. There was no coffin, only the city's edge. Rome had places for bodies like these, open pits, shallow graves, valleys of waste and bone. They were called puticuli, from the Latin for to rot. Here, the unnamed were laid beside others, stacked sometimes, covered loosely with dirt, then forgotten. No marker, no mourning, just a return to soil, fast, quiet, final. Dogs wandered nearby, so did crows. The city did not ban them. Even the earth here smelled different, greasy, sour. It was used again and again, bodies sinking into layers of older ones. And still the carts kept coming. No prayers were said, unless whispered by another prisoner far away who remembered the dead man's voice, or his hands, or the way he once chewed bread slowly, eyes closed. Some prison deaths were never reported, especially for slaves. A missing slave was not a mystery, just a gap in the ledger. And for foreigners, for the conquered, for the voiceless, there were no records at all, only bones beneath Rome. Occasionally someone tried to mark the spot, a stone, a flower, a name etched in wood. But the city erased such things. Wind, rain, and indifference took care of the rest. Even those who had once mattered could be erased. A senator who fell from favor, a soldier dishonored, their bodies treated no better. It was not cruelty, it was efficiency. Rome had too many mouths to feed, too many laws to uphold, too many wars to fund. The dead were not the state's concern. Only the living caused problems. If the prisoner died by starvation, there was no inquiry. If they died by infection, nothing was cleaned. The next prisoner took their place, and the cell did not change. Sometimes the straw was turned, sometimes not. The stain remained. So did the smell, and the memory, if it survived, stayed only with those who shared the dark. There are no Roman monuments to prison dead, no marble walls, no preserved names, only traces, bits of pottery, a tooth, a rusted chain clasp still curled like a hand. That is what remained, and even those were left to dust. So tonight, as you settle into warmth, think of the bodies that were not honored, not because they weren't worthy, but because no one was watching. They were lowered into the earth quietly, covered in silence, and remembered only by the city that forgot them. No one entered Roman prison looking the same as they would leave, if they left at all. The body, more than the mind, remembered. It kept the bruises, the aches, the small damages done not by violence but by time, hunger, and stone. Most Roman prisoners were not whipped or beaten daily. That was rare and often saved for execution. But suffering came without scars. It came slowly. It came through deprivation. The first thing to change was the skin. Prisoners were kept in dark spaces, often underground. No sunlight, no fresh air, just cold, wet stone. The skin reacted quickly. It paled, it dried. Then it softened, not in youth, but in decay. Mold lived in the walls, moisture lingered in the corners, and the pores absorbed it all. Some prisoners developed rashes, itches that never went away. Others grew sores, on the back, on the legs, anywhere pressed too long against unmoving stone. Bathing was rare, sometimes never. Fleas nested in blankets, lice bred in hair. The skin itched, cracked, bled, and still no one offered a cloth. The second change came in the teeth. Bread was the main food, but not fresh bread, not warm, soft loaves with honey or oil. Prison bread was hard, twice baked, rough with grit, from poor flour, from dirt, from haste. Prisoners chewed it slowly, or they didn't chew it at all. Over time, the teeth wore down. Molars cracked, gums receded, infections came. Some mouths bled daily, not from injury, but from erosion. And when the pain became too sharp, the prisoner swallowed whole. Some mouths rotted entirely. By the time of death, some skulls, when found centuries later, were missing nearly every tooth. The third change was in the bones. A body in confinement did not move much. Space was limited. Exercise was not routine. The legs stiffened. The spine curved. In some cases, the ribs became visible, not from starvation, but from stillness. Without walking, without sun, without heat, the bones shrank, not in size, in strength. If a prisoner left after many months, they walked hunched. They needed support. They could not run. Their hands, too, changed. From gripping stone, from shaking in cold, from wrapping themselves in cloth night after night just to feel a shape again. The fingernails thickened, sometimes cracked. One prisoner carved lines into the wall, a mark for every day. His thumb grew twisted, his wrist stiff. He never finished the year. The eyes adjusted to torchlight, to darkness. Pupils widened, sight dimmed. Prisoners who left Roman cells squinted in daylight. It burned. They covered their faces. They looked like ghosts. Even the stomach changed. After weeks of barley mash and bean water, the stomach forgot how to digest variety. When freedom came, and with it better food, many prisoners vomited, or cramped, or grew feverish. It was not the food's fault. It was the memory of the gut. It had been trained to expect little, to expect blandness, and now it rebelled. Some former prisoners never recovered. They lived with pain, silent, embarrassed, ashamed of what the cell had made permanent. And then there was the breath. It changed too. In prison, people breathed through the mouth. The nose clogged from dampness. The throat grew raw. The breath became shallow, dry, slow. Some developed coughs that lasted months. Some never breathed deeply again. You would not notice all these changes at once. But if you saw two men, one free, one who had lived beneath the stone, you would know. You would know by the curve of the spine, the look in the eyes, the shape of the hands, the sound of their voice, quiet even when not whispering. The body does not lie. It carries history better than parchment, better than stone. Even today, archaeologists have found Roman skeletons with signs of confinement, jaw wear, bone thinning, ankle abrasion from chains. These are not stories. These are facts, written not by poets, but by bones. So tonight, as your own body rests, full, warm, unchained, remember theirs, the ones that endured without record, that bore suffering in silence, that came out bent, but alive, at least for a little while longer. They didn't hear the world anymore. Once inside, beneath the marble and marble noise of Rome, the sounds changed. They didn't disappear. They simply slowed. A Roman prison was not silent. It was layered, low, occasionally sharp, mostly soft. The first sound was always the door, a thick, iron-latched gate. It opened with weight. It closed like finality. The clang echoed not once but twice off the stone walls. Then it was done. Some prisoners heard nothing after that, just breathing, their own, theirs, and someone else's in the dark. There were no windows, no wind, no bird song, only what lived inside. The chains made the next sound. Not everyone wore them, but many did. On the ankle, sometimes wrist. They didn't rattle the way stories say. They scraped, they clicked, they shifted only when the prisoner shifted. Some learned to sleep without moving, just to avoid the sound. At night, the cell changed again. You could hear breathing, rhythmic, software interrupted by coughs, not dry coughs, wet, thick, like breath moving through old fabric. When someone dreamt, they mumbled, sometimes names, sometimes prayers. Once, a prisoner recited numbers in his sleep, over and over, the same count. He stopped at 27. No one asked why. The walls carried sound poorly. Everything echoed. Even a whisper bounced back like a stranger. That's why most stayed quiet. Because the walls returned your words in a different tone, and it felt like someone else had spoken. Some cells were near drains. You could hear the water, not rushing, dripping, slow, steady, a drop every few seconds. It was the only sense of time some prisoners had. One man kept count, 60 drops to a minute. He marked the hours in his head. He died on the 4th day. There were rats, of course. You heard them before you saw them. Claws on stone, chewing. Sometimes squeaks, short, high, panicked. Sometimes silence, which was worse because it meant they were close. Occasionally you heard steps, not inside the cell, but above. Guard boots, slow, confident. Their pace never changed, even when someone screamed. And yes, sometimes there were screams, not often, just once in a while. From deep below, not long. just enough to remind everyone of the purpose of the place. Executions didn't make noise. Not much, just the final breath, or a soft groan, and then footsteps again, going the other way. Outside the cells, voices drifted, not clearly, muffled, like water through stone, a magistrate arguing, a guard complaining about wages. Once, faintly, a song. It was a lullaby. No one knew who sang it. It didn't come back. The loudest sounds weren't from outside. They came from within. The stomach. When empty long enough, it talked, gurgled, groaned, begged in a voice the prisoner couldn't quiet. Some laughed at it. Some wept. Some lay still and pretended not to hear. The body made other sounds too. Bones popping from cold. Teeth grinding at night. Nails scratching skin. In winter, you heard chattering. Not rats. Teeth. When frost came through the stone, it entered the bones, and prisoners shook, sometimes together, sometimes alone. The sound of chattering teeth became the only music. The cell was rarely truly silent. Even in sleep, the body remembered. Even in darkness, sound lived. Not loud, not constant, just enough to remind you weren't alone. And yet, you were. So as you lie down in silence tonight, know that someone long ago once lay in silence too. Not of peace, but of stone, of breathing, of waiting, and of the slow, soft music of a world that had nothing left to say. They didn't hear the world anymore. Once inside, beneath the marble and marble noise of Rome, the sounds changed. They didn't disappear. They simply slowed. A Roman prison was not silent. It was layered, low, occasionally sharp, mostly soft. The first sound was always the door, a thick, iron-latched gate. It opened with weight. It closed like finality. The clang echoed, not once but twice, off the stone walls. Then it was done. Some prisoners heard nothing after that, just breathing, their own, theirs, and someone else's in the dark. There were no windows, no wind, no birdsong, only what lived inside. The chains made the next sound. Not everyone wore them, but many did. On the ankle, sometimes wrist. They didn't rattle the way stories say. They scraped. They clicked. They shifted only when the prisoner shifted. Some learned to sleep without moving, just to avoid the sound. At night, the cell changed again. You could hear breathing, rhythmic, software, interrupted by coughs. Not dry coughs. Wet. Thick. Like breath moving through old fabric. When someone dreamt, they mumbled, sometimes names, sometimes prayers. Once, a prisoner recited numbers in his sleep, over and over, the same count. He stopped at the 27. No one asked why. The walls carried sound poorly. Everything echoed. Even a whisper bounced back like a stranger. That's why most stayed quiet. Because the walls returned your words in a different tone, and it felt like someone else had spoken. Some cells were near drains. You could hear the water, not rushing, dripping, slow, steady, a drop every few seconds. It was the only sense of time some prisoners had. One man kept count, 60 drops to a minute. He marked the hours in his head. He died on the 4th day. There were rats, of course. You heard them before you saw them. Claws on stone, chewing, sometimes squeaks, short, high, panicked, sometimes silence, which was worse because it meant they were close. Occasionally you heard steps, not inside the cell, but above. Guard boots, slow, confident. Their pace never changed, even when someone screamed. And yes, sometimes there were screams, not often, just once in a while, from deep below, not long, just enough to remind everyone of the purpose of the place. Executions didn't make noise, not much, just the final breath, or a soft groan, and then footsteps again, going the other way. Outside the cells, voices drifted, not clearly, muffled, like water through stone. A magistrate arguing, a guard complaining about wages. Once, faintly, a song. It was a lullaby. No one knew who sang it. It didn't come back. The loudest sounds weren't from outside. They came from within. The stomach. When empty long enough, it talked, gurgled, groaned, begged in a voice the prisoner couldn't quiet. Some laughed at it. Some wept. Some lay still and pretended not to hear. The body made other sounds too, bones popping from cold, teeth grinding at night, nails scratching skin. In winter, you heard chattering, not rats, teeth. When frost came through the stone, it entered the bones, and prisoners shook, sometimes together, sometimes alone. The sound of chattering teeth became the only music. When food came, you could hear it before you saw it. The bucket scraping, the short grunts of the jailer, then a brief clatter, tin against rock, no words, only that sound, and the slow scuffle of feet walking away. Sometimes, no food came at all, and the silence said more than noise ever could. The cell was rarely truly silent. Even in sleep, the body remembered. Even in darkness, sound lived. Not loud, not constant. Just enough to remind you, you weren't alone. And yet, you were. So as you lie down in silence tonight, know that someone long ago once lay in silence too. Not of peace, but of stone, of breathing, of waiting, and of the slow, soft music of a world that had nothing left to say. Not everyone died in a Roman prison. Some walked out. Not many, not often, but some. They emerged slowly, blinking in the sun, unsure if it was morning or afternoon. Their skin pale, their eyes sunken, their muscles thin and tight from months of stillness. The gate opened behind them. It clanged once, then silence. There were no farewells, no ceremony, just a city that kept moving, and a man who had forgotten how to move with it. Freedom did not come with food, not always. Sometimes it came with nausea, a dry mouth, a stomach not ready to taste meat or wine again. One prisoner, released after a year, was offered bread soaked in honey. He vomited after the first bite. Too sweet, too soft. His body had learned to resist comfort. The sun hurt too. It touched skin like a flame. It blinded. It warmed bones that had forgotten what warmth meant. He covered his eyes with his hand, and still the color burned. People looked at him, not cruelly, just curiously. They could smell the cell still clinging to his tunic. They stepped aside. He walked past a bakery, the smell of flour, olive oil, baking heat. And he felt hunger, real hunger, for the first time in months. But his hands shook, so he kept walking. Freedom was not celebration, it was confusion. No one explained what came next. If his house had been sold, it was gone. If his name had been erased from the ledger, there was no one to greet him. Sometimes he went to the temple, offered thanks. Sometimes he didn't. Sometimes he sat on a bench and watched people eat. The world had kept going. He had not. His fingers remembered the feel of cold stone, the weight of a tin cup, the sound of his own breath against walls. At night, he couldn't sleep on a soft bed. He lay on the floor. The hardness felt familiar, honest. His dreams were full of dripping, footsteps, chains. He didn't speak of the prison, not because he was ashamed, but because no one wanted to hear. Prison was invisible. And so was he. Sometimes other former prisoners found each other. They didn't say much. They sat near the fountain, drank water in silence. They understood what freedom meant, what it cost, what never came back. One man kept marking the wall of his new home, a notch every day, just as he had in his cell. After 2 years, he stopped. The wall didn't matter anymore. Some became philosophers, not public ones, just men who thought more than they spoke, who remembered how slow time could feel, how loud silence could be. A few returned to prison, not as inmates, but to visit, to bring bread, to speak softly to those still inside, to remind them that the gate might open. Others never went near again. The sound of that gate haunted them. It reminded them that even in freedom, the body still flinches, because it remembers the cold, the hunger, the waiting, the sound of rats, the sound of hope disappearing behind a locked door. Freedom wasn't peace, but it was breath and bread and sunlight even when it burned. And for those who lived, that was enough. It always began with the breath, not a gasp, not a cry, just the absence of sound, a silence where breath had once lived. In a Roman home, when someone died, truly died, the first act was not grief. It was the closing of the eyes. The body was touched. The eyelids were drawn shut by hand, softly, firmly, so the gaze would not linger between the living and the dead. Then came the mouth. The jaw was closed, if it wasn't already. If rigor had begun, a strip of cloth was tied around the head to hold it shut. Not cruel, just ritual. And then, always, the name was called. The closest relative leaned in, whispered, or spoke clearly. Veil. Farewell. They called the name, not for the dead to answer, but so the soul would know it was leaving. This was not belief. It was duty. Romans did not cry out at once. They did not fall to the floor. There was a structure to loss. And that structure began with preparation. The body wasn't moved right away. It lay where it had fallen, or where the bed had held it. The feet were turned toward the door, not for comfort, but to help the spirit, the anima, find its way out. Then the house changed. Mirrors were covered. Lamps were dimmed. The hearth fire was extinguished, because death polluted, and light was not meant to shine on a polluted home. Even the gods were silenced. Household shrines were closed. Images of the Lares and Penates, the domestic spirits, were veiled in cloth. They were not to witness death. They were not to be touched by it. Meanwhile, the body began to change. Within hours, the skin cooled, the limbs stiffened, and someone, often a slave, sometimes a woman of the house, began to wash the corpse. This was not done with perfumes. It was done with warm water, olive oil, a cloth wrung out slowly and passed gently over the face, chest, arms, legs. The dirt of life was removed. The stink of illness less so. The body was not embalmed. Rome did not preserve the dead. It cleaned them, dressed them, prepared them to be burned or buried. Fingers were trimmed, nails scraped, hair was brushed if there was time. Then came the dress, a white toga if the family could afford it, a simple tunic if they could not. No jewels, no sandals, just linen, cotton, or wool, folded tightly, wrapped with care. The dead did not go to the grave naked, but neither did they go in glory. The next act was older than the city itself. A coin was placed in the mouth, sometimes under the tongue, sometimes in the hand. This was not superstition, it was tradition. A fare for Charon, the boatman of the underworld. Romans did not believe in him literally, but they performed the gesture anyway, because forgetting the dead was worse than believing in ghosts. The house was quiet now. Visitors came, not to speak, to nod, to carry news. The death was announced, to neighbors, to clients, to officials if the man had rank. And then, only then, the body was laid out. In the atrium, if the house had one, on a low couch, with the feet still facing the door. This was called the collocation, the placement. Pine branches were hung around the room to mask the smell, to mark the presence of death. The body remained there for a day, sometimes two. Women keened softly, children were kept away. A single lamp burned, low, and beside the couch someone sat, not to guard against theft, but to keep the memory from slipping away, so that even now, as centuries pass, you might still imagine the room, dim-y heavy with pine and oil, a body lying still, a coin pressed between dry lips, and a name echoing once more through the silence. The day of the procession began before sunrise. The body had been laid out, washed, dressed, wrapped in white, the coin still in place, the feet still pointed toward the door. And now it was time to leave. In Roman belief, the dead could not stay. To linger too long was to risk unrest. Restless spirits were feared, not for violence, but for sadness. A soul without ceremony became a shadow, a whisper, a weight in the home that would not lift. So they prepared the final walk. In the early days of the Republic, the family carried the body themselves, on foot, through narrow streets, a bier made of wood. No wheels, no slaves, just hands holding the weight of memory. Later, as wealth grew, so did the show. Professional mourners were hired, women with trained voices. They wept loudly, tore their hair, scratched their cheeks until blood marked the skin. Not for grief, but for public duty. The louder the mourning, the more important the dead. Or so it seemed. Musicians played flutes, sometimes horns. The sounds were high, unsteady, mournful. They bounced off stone walls and followed the mourners like smoke. If the dead had status, a consul, a senator, a general, masks were worn. Actors marched ahead of the bier. Each wore a wax mask molded in the image of an ancestor. One for the grandfather, one for the great-uncle, one for a long-dead magistrate whose name was half forgotten. They did not speak. They did not look at the crowd. They simply walked in full Roman dress as if the past itself had returned. These masks were called imagines, and the practice, the slow parade of ancestry, reminded everyone that the dead belonged to a lineage, a house, a memory that stretched beyond the grave. Behind them came the bier. If the family could afford it, it was carried by slaves, 6, sometimes 8. The body, still wrapped, lay flat. No coffin, just cloth, exposed to air and incense. Garlands of laurel or rosemary might be draped across the chest. Not for beauty, for the scent. The smell of the body was never far behind. Even after oils, even after washing, the crowd knew. Behind the body walked the family, head bowed, clothes torn at the shoulder, a sign of mourning. No jewelry, no makeup, no smiles. They did not speak. They did not greet. Even slaves walked in silence. Sometimes a child carried a torch, even in daylight. It was symbolic, a reminder that light must guide the soul to the underworld. Sometimes a freedman held a portrait, a painted likeness of the deceased, done before death. Eyes wide, lips still, as if watching the funeral from within the frame. The procession wound slowly through the streets, through the Subura, past the Forum, toward the Esquiline Gate, or beyond the city walls where the dead were allowed to rest. Romans did not bury their dead inside the city. It was illegal. It was impure. The roadways leading out of Rome became cemeteries, lined with tombs, marked with inscriptions. Here lies, lived well, died young, missed. Sometimes the funeral was grand, other times forgotten. A pauper might be carried out at dawn. No music, No wailing, just one man, 2 coins, and a ditch carved into dry earth. But even then, there was movement, there was farewell, because even the poorest Roman feared being unburied. To be left exposed and unwept was the deepest shame. The procession was not for the gods, it was not for the law, it was for the dead. So they would not be alone, so the footsteps would echo long after the body had gone. And when the last mourner passed and the dust settled, and the music faded, only the memory remained of a walk, a wait, and the hush of a city that remembered briefly how to say goodbye.